All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Michael Fangman, and I'm a product designer for Secure. Today, I want to talk about my experience being a product designer and leading jobs to be done research for the secret detection product category within my Sage group. So first, I just want to start by giving a little background around the project. So the static analysis group has decided to prioritize our UX efforts in FY25 towards enhancing the secret detection product category, with the goal of overhauling this category to make secret detection a seamless, platform-wide feature that's enabled by default for all users. And to support this goal, we wanted to first start by better understanding the specific needs, motivations, and goals or outcomes of users when managing detected secrets within their workflow, so that we can make sure that the work we're doing is meeting their expectations well. So for this project, I assumed the role of the lead researcher, but I also want to acknowledge all the people that helped provide support throughout this initiative, all of which are listed on the slide here in the lower right-hand side. So next, I just want to take a quick look at the process that I went through for this project. So for this initiative, I followed the new jobs to be done playbook process that our UX research team has put together. Many of you may be familiar with that, but for those who aren't, here's a quick overview of that process. So the first step is to create an assumptive job to be done canvas. Then you would move on to the second step, which is conducting interviews with people who perform that job. Then step 3 is to synthesize those interviews with the ultimate goal of creating a single aggregated job canvas. Then you would move on to step 4 to create outcome statements based on that canvas that you created in step 3. And then in step 5, you would conduct a survey to determine opportunity scores based on the outcome statements that you created. So here's an example of just a blank job to be done canvas if you're not aware. In the center here, we have the main target job. So this is essentially the main job that you want to learn about. In the upper left-hand side, we have the job performer. So this is essentially the person that you want to innovate for. In the top center, we have the aspirations. So this is basically what they want to become by performing this job. In the top right-hand side, we have related jobs. So these are other tasks that the job performer is trying to get done that's related to the target job. In the bottom left-hand side, we have emotional and social aspects. So this is essentially how the job performer wants to feel or be perceived when performing this job. In the bottom center, we have outcomes. So this is how the job performer measures success of completing the target job. And then in the bottom right-hand side, we have the job differentiators. So these are factors or circumstances that impact how the job gets done. And then lastly, across the center, we have the job steps. And so this is essentially the process or task of actually doing the job. So now I'll go ahead and go through each step of the job to be done playbook process in a little bit more detail. And I'll share some of the challenges that I encountered while going through it and things that I learned that I'm hoping to leverage next time to make the process a little bit easier. So as I had mentioned, the first step in the job to be done playbook process is creating an assumptive job to be done canvas. And so for this phase, you essentially start by identifying the job performer and the main job that you want to learn about, and then use those to create an assumptive job to be done canvas. Some of the challenges that I faced while going through this first step is that this is my first time creating a job to be done canvas. And so it took me a little bit of time to get up to speed. As you saw in the previous slide, there's a lot of different components to these canvases, and there's specific instructions on how to fill in each one. The next challenge that I faced is that I actually focused my work one level lower than what was necessary. So instead of creating a single job to be done canvas for the main job, I actually broke that main job down into 4 distinct smaller jobs and created assumptive canvases for each of those. And in some ways, I think this was helpful because it really pushed me to dig deep into the details of these smaller jobs, but it ultimately meant that I spent more time than needed creating these assumptive canvases. And after creating these 4 canvases around the smaller jobs, I still went back and created a single canvas for the main job. So in total, I ended up actually creating 5 assumptive job to be done canvases, when in all honesty, I really just needed to create 1. And the last challenge that I faced is that I spent a lot of time sweating the details. I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything. And so I did a lot of research and cast a really wide net to make sure that I covered my bases well. And thinking about going through this phase and some of the challenges that I experienced, there's a few things that I learned. First of which is that I just learned a ton about jobs to be done canvases as a whole. The process is rather systematic, and I think that's a really good thing because it results in a consistent artifact that, once understood, is a really powerful resource to have. The next thing I learned is that creating a single job canvas around the main job is way more valuable than creating multiple canvases around separate smaller jobs. Obviously, creating these multiple canvases is a big time investment, and it actually ended up just being too much information for stakeholders to wrap their heads around and review as well. And the last learning that I'll share here is that having a medium to high level comprehension of that main job is generally sufficient for this step. While I'm sure the level of detail that I explored was helpful in some ways, the interview phase that comes in the next step actually uncovers and provides a lot of that detail. So the next step in the job to be done playbook process is actually conducting the interviews. And for me, this started by creating a script that had essentially a canned intro and then a list of questions that I wanted to make sure I covered. And then all of that obviously was based on the Assumptive job canvases that I had made in the previous step. I then went through to create a screener to identify qualified participants to speak with, and then collaborate with our UX research coordinator to recruit participants, and then actually went through to conducting interviews. So some of the challenges that I faced while going through this phase is that at first we actually only planned to conduct 5 interviews, but I inadvertently had interviewed 3 people from the exact same company. Granted, they had different roles and were on different teams, but we felt that this had the potential to bias our research. And so we opted to expand the number of total interviews to 10. And I think in the end, this actually was a good thing. The next challenge I faced is that the pool of qualified participants was heavily skewed towards larger companies. And I think this is a really common scenario when you're doing research related to security, because it tends to be big companies who invest more time and resources into security. But we wanted to make sure that we had a diverse perspective. And so it took a little bit of time to find qualified participants from smaller and medium-sized companies. The last challenge I faced is that we did have one participant who passed the screener and got into the interview phase, but it turned out that they weren't really well qualified for the study. While conducting the interview, it quickly became apparent that the company that they worked for didn't actually employ any systems for secret identification or prevention. And they were just more merely curious about the process. And so unfortunately, I had to cut this interview off early and find a replacement participant. And so there's 2 learnings that came out of the interview process for me. First of which is that it's really important to consider the diversity of interviews and set those standards prior to sending out invitations to participants. And going forward, I'll be even more intentional about the individuals and their backgrounds and consider how they all contribute to the overarching research goal. And then the other learning here is that it's really important to know what info you need and to not be afraid to end an interview early if you're not getting it. It's better to save your and their time than it is to try to get useful info out of a poorly qualified participant. Then moving on to step 3, it's synthesizing the interview data. And so for me, this started by reviewing each of the sessions and taking detailed notes for each. I didn't have a note taker during the sessions itself, and I tend to find it pretty difficult to focus if I'm trying to multitask on too many different things. I'd rather be present in the conversation and focus on the questions and then review it all after the fact. So for me, after I created detailed notes around each session, I then went through, reviewed those notes, and started to map out the different workflows that participants went through and filled out the job to be done canvas for each session. I then moved forward to aggregate all of these sessions together, looking for different trends and commonalities and reducing it down to a single job canvas. Some of the challenges I faced while going through this phase is that while working on the individual sessions, I found that not all sections of the canvas were able to be filled in. And for me in particular, the emotional and social aspects were particularly lacking in this area. The next challenge I faced is that many participants tended to perform the same or similar tasks, but the order and nuance of each of those tasks often differed a bit. And so it was challenging when synthesizing the individual canvases together. And then after thinking about the challenges and this process, there are 3 learnings that came out of this. First of which is that it's possible to leverage the information you have from other aspects of the canvas to fill in some of the missing pieces. So Michael Oliver, the UX researcher for my team, helped me identify some of the emotional and social aspects based on other info we had in the canvas, which was really great. The next learning is that sometimes you have to use your best judgment when synthesizing this data. You may need to generalize some aspects, but trust your intuition and focus on commonalities above all else. And the last learning is that these interviews tend to yield a lot of useful data beyond just what is needed for jobs to be done canvases, and it can be really beneficial to gather that data. So for me, I was able to identify a number of different problems and pain points that participants experienced while performing this job, as well as potential opportunities for innovation that were repeated again and again. And then I also gathered any competitor tools that were mentioned during the interviews as well. Then coming into step 4, it is to construct outcome statements. And for me, this is where I'm currently at today, but I still do have a few challenges and learnings to share with you. So this step generally involves creating outcome statements for each of the tasks in the job steps. And for those who might not be aware, these outcome statements typically follow a pretty standard format. And that is having a direction of change. So for example, increasing or decreasing something, having a unit of measure or a success metric. Often this is like likelihood or effort, having an object of need, and essentially this is the thing being affected, and then having to clarify what provides context around the circumstance. So some of the challenges that I face is that each task can actually have a number of potential outcomes, and those outcome statements can be written in multiple ways. Thus, getting these outcome statements right actually takes a bit more work than I originally had anticipated. So to give one example of this, I wrote two different outcome statements that essentially say the exact same thing. First of which is to increase the likelihood of secret leaks being detected before they are committed to a repository. And the second one is to decrease the likelihood of secret leaks being committed to a repository. So obviously these say the exact same thing, and it's just important to be very concise around your language to basically make sure that these outcome statements are very distinct. And so some of the learnings that came out of this phase so far is that getting the language right is hard, and it's important to make sure these outcome statements are concise and distinct from other outcome statements. And once this step is complete, I will then move on to the next and last phase in the job to be done playbook process, and that is determining opportunity scores. And so for this step, we basically take the outcome statements that were constructed in the previous step, and then we create a survey and ask two specific questions about each outcome. First of which is, how important is that outcome to you? And how well is this outcome currently being satisfied? And then these scores are then essentially, for each of these questions, are calculated together to create an opportunity score. And one of the challenges that I'm already seeing or anticipate facing is that on the surface, this survey seems like it's a pretty simple and straightforward process. But after talking to my UX researcher, the process is actually a little bit more complex than that. So as a result, the group's UX researcher is going to be taking the lead at this step, and I'll be assuming more of a supporting role. But I'm hoping to learn a lot about this last step and excited to see what outcomes we get. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot of value that product designers can gain from leading this kind of research. For me, it was really an excellent way to deepen my domain knowledge, to build user empathy, and I think it will lead to better designed outcomes as the process of integrating these insights into the design process is a bit more seamless. I think that covers it. Thank you for listening. And then I will open it up to any questions if anyone has any. It looks like there's possibly a few already in here.
Yeah, great presentation, Michael. I actually have the first question as well.
Awesome.
Early on in the presentation, you mentioned that initially you had created the job to be done canvas at the wrong level. So how did you determine that you had created it at the wrong level? And then what are the indicators that you look for to make sure that the job is at the right level?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I actually didn't figure this out until after I had put the canvases together and put them in an issue for feedback. I was actually working with my design manager, Justin, who actually was going through and providing a lot of good feedback, but kept asking questions that kind of tied back to and hinting that we should kind of focus having a single job canvas around the main job. And I actually had like a small diagram in that issue too, where I had the main job and then the four distinct separate jobs. And he was kind of wondering where that job canvas was for the main job. So just basically getting feedback from people helped me to realize that that was actually a specific need. I don't know if I covered all of your question there. I'm curious what else I missed here.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on this, but any indicators that you look for to make sure that the job is at the right level?
Yeah, so I think another aspect of this too, beyond just thinking about sort of the feedback that I got, is that it's important just for the process as a whole to focus on that main job. And since I broke that main job down into several smaller jobs, I think that was a good indicator that I wasn't necessarily focusing on the right level, because the job steps that you go through essentially speak to all of these different smaller jobs. And so I think I was just kind of deviating from the process and kind of tweaking it how I thought made sense. But in hindsight, it wasn't really necessary to get that detailed.
Thank you. Vitika, you have the next question, it looks like.
Thanks, Emily. So Michael, I was curious about the part when you mentioned that there were a few surprising things, and one of that was each job can have a number of outcomes. I'm curious about what that would look like. Can you share an example?
Yeah, absolutely. I could try to pull up my Figma file real quick. for that. I don't have it open. But just to give one example, I'll just talk through it instead of trying to dig through my files and try to find it. So one example that I shared, so a lot of times we found that people were trying to identify secrets within their IDE before they got pushed, before like the code got pushed up to a repository. And there's a number of outcomes that can come from that. So first of which is potentially, let's say, looking to identify secrets before they can get committed to a repository. Another outcome is that essentially you have developer adoption of the security tools in the early phase. And then another possible outcome could be that teams are following security guidelines to according to like org standards. So I think there's different, like each different step can have potentially multiple outcomes. But it really depends because some steps it's very black and white. You have this and you have one outcome. But I think if you really think about like certain tasks in the process, there's generally multiple ways or multiple like reasons why you would go about that task. And I think
Yeah.
even in the jobs to be done process as a whole, they had mentioned that like for each job canvas, you may have upwards of 50 or more outcomes that people are looking for from it.
That's a good point. I think that also kind of surfaces this fact that when you're doing a jobs to be done research for one job, you're able to get information that would be helpful for many other designers in those other stage groups. And so when you think of these outcomes, like for example, pushing code to a repository also triggers a pipeline. And then comes the part where you follow up with the status of the pipeline. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good one.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
Give a couple more seconds of awkward silence if anyone thinks of anything.